Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. For over 5 months now, Kashmir has been under a lockdown. For more than 127 days, the valley has been silenced. While there is an attempt to make an abnormal situation a normal reality, it's important to center the debate regarding this subject. The subject in this case being the 8 million Kashmiris in Jammu and Kashmir. On today's show, we take a closer look at what's happening in and around Kashmir. Joining us for this discussion is Taimur Rehman, who's a political scientist and an associate professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He joins us from Lahore. Also joining us is Dr. Samina Yasmeen, who is a teacher and researcher at the University of Western Australia. She joins us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Rehman, let me begin with you. Now, it's been 5 months since this lockdown, since this draconian clampdown. Do you see a shift in the narrative regarding Kashmir? Do you see and observe any changes in how the news about it is being reported?
When the clampdown first began, or rather when certain constitutional changes were first made in India, there was a big hue and cry at the United Nations, and it did seem like the United Nations may pass some resolutions or undertake some dialogue between Kashmiris, Indians, Pakistanis, whatnot. But the only change one notices is that, in fact, the entire issue has been greeted with incredible apathy by the international community. And the status quo, as you know, remains in force in Kashmir and across South Asia. So no positive changes as such to report on the ground here at all.
Right. Dr. Samina Yasmeen, as Dr. Taimur Rehman stated, that it is a narrative that was built regarding Kashmir by the Indian media, by the Indian state. Now, in all of this, Kashmir still remains silent because the people there can't speak out to the world. Even if there is apathy, is there a recognition in the international community that this is still an abnormal reality?
I think if it is a recognition, it's very quietly held recognition, which, as Taimur has said, has lost its significance in the last few months. And the reason is not because it's not significant enough, but because the way Indian narrative was developed around different capitals in the world and also international organizations. And also the fact that the world has been tired over the number of decades thinking that the Kashmir issue can't really be settled. We see a condition where it's there, and when you mention it, for example, even in the US Senate, people would recognize that it exists, but the extent to which they're willing to take a stand on it, that's very different. And in that, I would say there's a comparison that can be drawn between what's happening in Indian part of Kashmir and the Palestinian, especially the Gaza situation. That when something happens, everyone is very concerned, they talk about it, and within a few weeks they forget about it because it's like considered to be a given that cannot be tackled and then must not be addressed because other parties could be affected in this process.
Right. And as you mentioned that you're drawing this parallel between Kashmir and Palestine. Now, this is one that has been continuously being drawn, not just because of the state of silence, but also because of the torture tactics being used, because of the apartheid that is being instilled on that location. Dr. Taimur Rehman, when we're talking about this general apathy, now, is this extended and only specific to Kashmir, or is this going regarding most of the conflicts we see all across the world today? Is this conflict fatigue that we're witnessing at this point in time?
No, I don't think it's conflict fatigue at all, because, I mean, on the issues that the West is concerned about, where its own interests are at stake, they act very quickly and they're ready to spend quite substantial resources to fix those crises. So it's not conflict fatigue. I mean, we haven't gone through any major world war in the recent past, or even any major war for that matter in the recent past, barring some regional wars and so on. So no, I don't think it's conflict fatigue at all. I think it's a question of interest.
Now, in the last 5 months, I mentioned this before as well, we haven't heard from those who are living inside the valley, obviously because of this communications blackout. Is there a recognition that the very subject of the story, the very subject of all this politics is missing from this? I mean, we're talking about the two antagonists here, we're talking about the two big states here, but the actual subject is missing.
Well, sadly, in the realm of, I'm a bit of a realist in the realm of international politics. The actual subject has been missing from discussions in international politics for a very, very, very long time, if it was ever present. Great powers, they think about their interests mainly, and that's how states really work. And so while, many, many people suffer, there are people suffering in other parts of the globe as well, and they are not given any attention. The real problem, as far as the international community sees it, is that India and Pakistan could go to war over Kashmir, and both states are nuclear armed, and that has to be prevented at all costs. That is the main concern of international powers, sadly. Not that, Kashmiris are not being given their democratic rights and that sort of thing. India has very successfully argued that this is an internal constitutional change and that the international community should not be concerned about it, or should not be concerned to intervene in any regard. So absolutely, while the real subject is history is missing here, or the real subject of oppression is missing over here, I don't think that's a line of argument that will appeal to the humanitarian in all of us. But if we're going to be very realistic in international politics, we have to see what interests are aligned where and how those can be lobbied or utilized for the betterment of people. And in the context in which the main concern of international powers is to avoid war between India and Pakistan, and really they are not too deeply concerned about other human rights issues in Kashmir, etc.
Dr. Samina, do you also share those views that Dr. Taimur Rehman just laid out in front of us right now?
What was implied in the message that Dr. Taimur Rehman was talking about, the fact that India has been emerging as a global power, or is at least being recognized as a global power, the possibility or the promise of 300-400 million people who can be the consumers is so strong that it's not just simply in the diplomatic realm that countries are reluctant, it's also in the business realm. Because the moment you take a stand against the Indian position, you run the risk of not getting the business that is possible in India. And I think a combination of those interests and considerations are really at the heart of why the Kashmiri voice is not being heard.
Dr. Samina Yasmeen, even in this case, when we had an international fact-finding body by the United Nations come in and bring out a report in 2018 and in 2019, it talked about the state of Indian-occupied Kashmir, it talked about the state of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and it did state how there are certain freedoms being curtailed within Azad Kashmir, but the violations within Indian-occupied Kashmir were those that were equivalent to disappearances, pellet gun injuries, many other things which could not be equated. So in this entire conflation, is there a way to actually bring attention to the fact that what is happening in Kashmir is abnormal? The fact that for 5 months now, people have not been able to communicate with their families living abroad, that is abnormal.
Just like what happens in Palestine, the world gets used to this kind of sort of lack of human rights, and they start looking at their own interests, other interests that make them think, we know it's happening, but we're not going to comment on it, and let's focus. I think what we need to point out is that it's okay to do this, but again, let's learn from what's happened in Palestine and see what the long-term impact of such silence on part of the global community can be for the stability of the region and even the world. And I think for that, you can't get away from the fact that what's happened to Palestine, especially in Gaza and the West Bank, has created a situation where generations of people who have been subjected to oppression as kids, when they grow up, they have got a very different sense of what they are as opposed to what the other side is.
And Dr. Samina Yasmeen, on that point, I want to introduce another guest who's joined us because that's an essential point, intergenerational witnessing violence and that having impact from generation to generation. On that point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shaheen Shora, who's a psychiatrist and a consultant in national at NHS. She joins us from the UK. Thank you so much, Dr. Shora, for joining us. Now, when we're talking about violence and especially how it carries on from generation to generation, whether it's in the case of Kashmir or whether it's in the case of Palestine, give us insight. How does that impact a person's emotional and mental makeup?
In any conflict area, other than Palestine, other than Kashmir, this has been going on for generations now. It's the third generation in Kashmir, Indian-occupied Kashmir, that's being affected now. You really grow up with a sense of fear, with a sense of uncertainty about your future. You also grow up with a lot of mistrust. And you really are in a sort of a mental turmoil when you're growing up. It's not a normal upbringing that you have because you adapt to a very different, a very hostile environment around you. And that leads to manifestations in various forms. And if you look at the report done by Médecins Sans Frontières in 2015, which is the Doctors Without Borders in Indian-occupied Kashmir, actually half of the population has got, about 45% have shown symptoms of mental distress. And, that really in itself is abnormal. If you imagine that half of the population is having some form of a mental distress. And then if we break it down, about 41% of the population, which is adults and adolescents, teenagers, even young children, are actually diagnosed and treated for depression, 26% for anxiety, and we have a huge number of people now, including women, children, young people, and also the older generation that are actually now coming out with symptoms suggestive of post-traumatic stress disorder because they have lived through this turmoil not only for generations, but in the last 30 years, there has been so much violence inflicted in every shape and form,
Right.
We talk about, disappearances, we talk about third-degree tortures, we talk about detentions under the name of security, but we are also really putting these people through intense negotiations then. So, for example, if minors are detained, which was the case since the abrogation of Article 370, 5th of August, these parents go through tremendous psychological and mental unrest, but also they have no means at all of communicating with their children who are taken and detained in far-flung jails in India.
And Dr. Shora, on that specific point, you're talking about the forced appearances under the Public Safety Act. Now, we know that minors, which includes children even as old as 9 years old, are being picked up, they're being taken, boys, men of family members, mostly this is the makeup. How does that impact an entire family structure?
Can you imagine if your child is picked up, you then have to really first of all find out the whereabouts, and the whereabouts can only be given to you by the very people who are responsible for, picking up your child under the Public Safety Act. Under the Public Safety Act, the problem is that you can be detained without charge, without a means to trial for up to 2 years. That's a complete emotional upheaval for the parent, apart from the practical difficulties in getting any access. These people are from very modest backgrounds. They can't even afford to hire a lawyer or even, buy an air ticket to fly out of Kashmir to go in other parts of India to meet their children. And there is a sense of complete helplessness and desperation. And it's now really getting to a stage of hopelessness because we are 5 months on, there is no shift in terms of giving people an access to even communicate with the outside world. Yes, some postpaid telephones are working, but there's really nothing else. They can't speak. People are not allowed to get together in a group of more than four. They have got, again, the state government has completely collapsed, so there's nobody in terms of the judiciary that you could go to and appeal, because, you really can be detained without charge for up to 2 years. So it has a huge psychological impact. The people are physically suffering, but also, can you imagine the repercussions this is going to have? Because this is an ongoing problem.
Right.
It's not that there is an end in the solution. I can't see an end.
And Dr. Shora, you're talking about how this is ongoing, and we have been mentioning that as well. Now it's 5 months, almost 127 days of this happening. And of course, there have been curfews in Kashmir before as well that have been prolonged. But this one is different. This one was unprecedented in many ways. Now, the hopelessness and that sentiment, that specific sentiment for children who are very young, seeing that and feeling that, what impact would that have in terms of wanting to develop, wanting to move forward? How would that impact a person's psyche at a very fundamental level?
Well, they really have got no hope. I mean, they feel so uncertain about their future. Their education is affected. I mean, there have been no proper schools open since the 5th of August. Yes, in end of October, beginning of November, they did conduct some examinations under very, very dire circumstances for the children, but there is no ongoing education. They are not just being deprived of that, they're also being deprived of being able to communicate with families outside of Kashmir. But they have got really no hope about their future. In fact, since August the 5th, the amount of children that are being seen with anxiety, with insomnia, with depression by psychologists in the main big hospital in Srinagar, which is called the SMHS hospital. I mean, we just can't cope anymore. We don't have the infrastructure to even cope with the mental health impacts on these children, but also not to forget that they now see no future for themselves, because
Right.
There was the national examinations that were to be conducted just last week or the week before, and there is no internet facilities for students to sit these examinations because many of them are online. They can't prepare for these exams because there is no study material that they can avail, apart from the old style textbooks, which the world has moved.
And Dr. Shaheen Shora, the fact that education is being disrupted is one of the most glaring issues when we talk about the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Kashmir. Thank you so much for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Dr. Taimur Rehman, going back to you, I do want to talk about the Public Safety Act, which has reportedly almost imprisoned over 13,000 people since August 5th. Now, what long-term implications does this have when a tool like this is used to oppress those the state deems as dissidents, to be used as curtailing freedom of expression, as being used as a tool to just pick up people in the middle of the night and take them and imprison them? What long-term implications would this have on society?
Well, actually, the long-term implications for India are going to be very negative, because the one thing that led to the de-escalation of violence in the context of Kashmir after the JKLF emerged and then the Hurriyat Conference, etc., was the fact that India continued to have regular elections. So a substantial portion of Kashmiri nationalist opinion and politicians, etc., were participating as MLAs in elections within Kashmir, and so clamping down on that will obviously result in the fact that the populace as a whole and many political figures in particular will feel that the democratic path is no longer viable. So they may resort to other means. They may resort to violent means, etc. They may resort to civil disobedience. They may resort to strikes. They may resort to any and all other means that are at their disposal. So I think, Indian politicians, especially opposition politicians like, what's his name, like Congress and specifically CPIM and CPI have been very, very clear on this issue. The communists and the left in India have been very, have been campaigning on this issue that this is going to undermine Indian democracy as a whole. And the fact that you need 900,000, army men to enact such a law, to keep a population quiet, and you need to, imprison a whole host of people. Sitaram Yachuri recently went and met, Yusuf Terigami, who's a 5-time MLA winner of the CPIM, who's a cancer patient, and he's under house arrest over there, along with, obviously many other people. The figures I've heard are different from the ones that you quoted. I heard there were about 3,000 people in detention, but who knows how many people are in detention. The point is that thousands are. So I think the overall impact for Indian democracy, for the health of Indian secularism, for the health of the Indian democratic constitution is going to be very negative.
Dr. Samina Yasmeen, now Dr. Taimur Rehman talked about the Hindutva-led ideology of the BJP and what is happening in India, the ramifications of it, how it's adversely impacting the people there. Now, when we talk about that, we know about the list of human rights violations going on within India as well because of the Hindutva-led sentiments that are fostering. When we talk about international pressure, do you think there's any concern being given to what is happening there?
I think that's a mixed picture because Hindutva is combined at the same time with this emerging focus on Modi as basically a star or a Bollywood-like star. And so in that situation, you see people who forget about the fact that what's really happening in India in terms of the Hindutva ideology may not be as appealing. They look at Modi as an appealing international leader and they start focusing their attention on him. So I think that sort of starts weakening. Where another thing I think we need to think about is that what's happening in Kashmir, Indian part of Kashmir, is not just limited only to the South Asian space. There are communities both from India and Pakistan and even from Kashmir itself that are based in different parts of the world. So once we have these narratives that emerge out of India that look at anything that's different as not being acceptable, those ideas get transferred among the diasporic communities. And so then we see a possibility, and there are already some signs emerging, of intercommunal disharmony in the overseas space. And I think that complicates the whole picture.
Right, of course.
So you can't just say,
right. I take your point there. Personally, Dr. Samina Yasmeen, we've run short on time for this segment. We have to go for a break, but I take your point there. That's an essential point you've made, that the ideas transfer because we have many people living in all parts of the world belonging to these communities. Those ideas transfer and then they replicate and reproduce. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Samina Yasmeen, for joining us from Perth and Dr. Taimur Rehman for joining us from Lahore. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the show as we talk about what is unfolding in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Now joining us for this discussion is Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, who's an analyst and chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global. He joins us from London. Also joining us is Ms. Syeda Ayesha Sheeraz, who's a psychologist, joining us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Qureshi, let me begin with you. Now, we have been talking about how Kashmir enters the 5th month of a complete lockdown. What are the sentiments abroad, especially of the Kashmiri diaspora community? What are the efforts being made continuously in order to revive this issue, in order to bring attention to the plight of the people there?
As you rightly said, it's been around 5 months now since the whole of Kashmir Valley, which is predominantly Muslim majority dominated, has been under siege. A valley that used to be known as a paradise on earth has now been turned into the world's largest open-air prison, with the presence of more than 1 million armed forces who are backed up by draconian laws such as AFSPA and PSA, providing them with a complete impunity to conduct any human rights violations on the peace-loving civilian population of Kashmir. Now imagine over 8 million civilians who have been asking for their right of self-determination, a basic fundamental human rights that is guaranteed to every individual in this world, not just a guarantee by default, but a guarantee that was backed up by the international community, which was signed by the Indian government and the Pakistani government, as well as the international community, is being denied for them. And just for asking that basic right of self-determination, the people of Kashmir have been besieged for over 5 months with no access to food, medicine, transportation, a limited telecommunication, a limited media that gets filtered through to make sure only the narrative that the current BJP fascist government wants the world to hear is being filtered out to the world.
Mr. Qureshi, on that point, I do want to ask now, as you've stated, that the narrative that is going out to the world, because there is such a tight control on the media, the coverage of what is happening within Kashmir is that is coming out of India. How do we know about the on-ground situation, the fact that there is a lack of medical supplies, the fact that educational institutes are suffering, the fact that healthcare is suffering?
So, absolutely a brilliant question. There's a limited amount of information that's coming out of Kashmir, and unfortunately you hit the point right on its head, is we don't really have a clear, true picture of what's happening on the ground. We can only assume, based on the last 40 years of the activities that the illegal Indian occupation forces have been doing within the Kashmir, we can just imagine what's happening. But the limited information that's coming out through from the people who are actually able to fly out of the valley into New Delhi or other parts or abroad even sometimes, the situation that we're getting is that the Kashmir Valley is really in a dire situation and it's worsening day by day. Just yesterday, if you look at, read the news, there was a news article, the temperature on the top of all the atrocities, the gagging of the media, the blockades on the economical and medical facilities, the temperature in many parts of the valley, the Ladakh and Jammu, have dropped to minus 25 degrees. And these are the people who lived on the basic means now have to also survive under these harsh conditions with no availability to aid, whether that's international or local. We're unable to get that aid, the basic aid for them to survive into the valley. And that, the situations are really grim happening within the Kashmir. The information that's coming out is really minimum on the true what's happening on the ground. All the
Mr. Qureshi, you made a very important point here, that the assumptions that are being drawn are on the basis of what has been witnessed, what has been reported in the past 40 years. And that was when this situation, this unprecedented clampdown did not exist. So one can only imagine, and then couple that with the limited number of reports that are coming out, what the situation is. Stay with me. I want to jump to Ms. Sheeraz and talk to her about what the psychological impact of all this would be. Now, Ms. Sheeraz, we earlier on in the show discussed the aspects of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, how this would impact future generations. But I do want to talk about when a family doesn't know whether they're going to get a meal the next day, if their elderly family members will get medicine the next day, how will that create aggression and anger within them?
Thank you for having me on the show. I think it's a very devastating and a very unfortunate incident, what is happening in Kashmir. To begin with, I think it's a very general understanding that war is always going to have a very, very negative impact on the people who are suffering, who are into the middle of it. The war affects children in all the way it affects adults, specifically if I talk about children. I feel children who grow up in the midst of the war, as in if we would talk about Kashmir, they are at a greater risk of developing very, very challenging behavior. Let's say, as you mentioned, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, fear, nightmares, sleep disorders are the most sort of common problems that are being reported scientifically, which is again associated with the traumatization they're witnessing. Irritability, outburst of anger, internalizing and externalizing symptoms, which is going to, I think, if not resolve resolved at one particular time, if not addressed, if not given the proper mental health facilities or cares, I think they are going to impact their lives. Their mental health problems, I think it's even alarming that their mental health problems are also going to be associated with functional impairments. If they have, I don't think so. They will be able to perform as good in their academia or in the school as of their normal children. They carry out their usual duties or engage into social relationships. I think there will be trauma. Obviously, extreme poverty, lack of resources for health provisioning, breakdown of the school system, as well as increasing rate of family and community violence. It has a very, very devastating impact on the psychological upbringing and development of children.
Right. Mr. Zaffar, going back to you now, as you were talking about the state within Kashmir, now when we put that in a global context, how the world is viewing this and the international pressure that was expected and is hoped and expected for to be put on India and in order to bring light to this matter. Now, how do you feel like that has changed, or if that has changed at all? And what do you think the diaspora community is doing, especially the Kashmiris abroad, to bring attention to this?
A very valid point, and I think this, expectation of the international community, there were high hopes that we would have. I'll start with the current diaspora community that we have across the globe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Europe, Middle East, as well as the Far East. Alhamdulillah, the diaspora Kashmiri community, especially the people who are directly linked to the Indian-occupied Kashmir, have been really active. And I've seen a lot of activism that's taking place in the last 5 months. We've had protests happening in the United States. We had people going to the Senate, to the parliamentarians in the United Kingdom, to the European Parliament, lobbying and creating more awareness. We've got youth who are actually liaising with the universities. You got in the United States, you got Stand With Kashmir. Over here, you got Kashmir Campaign Global, Tehreek Kashmir, and many other organizations. In the Middle East, you've got Kashmir Cavitas, who's alhamdulillah taken the boldly step in sort of lobbying and creating an awareness in Middle East as well as Far East. Alhamdulillah, we're reaching out to the community, the peace-loving community, to make sure that they actually understand what the issue is. I know there's a massive narrative being created that, it's an abrogation of Article 370, but really the core problem is that the people of Kashmir have been denied their basic right of self-determination by the illegal occupational forces and the government since last 73 years. As I said previously, this is a promise that was made to them by the United Nations and the international community, the key parties being India and Pakistan at that point. And now they're going back, illegally abrogating the Article 370 that sort of underpinned the temporary administration with India until the right of self-determination.
Right.
Now, from the international community, to be honest, we did expect a lot more, because a similar move had taken place back in 1950s when India claimed that the Legislative Assembly could actually act as the plebiscite. But at that point, we saw a strong lobbying on the international platform, and a resolution, Article 122 of the United Nations, was implemented and agreed that such measures or such moves will not be equating to the right of self-determination, and any change to the geography, demography, or plebiscite would be illegal. But what we're seeing now is even that level of international mobilization or diplomacy from our supporters hasn't taken place. What we're seeing is a statement which kind of changes the narrative to say that Kashmir is a bilateral issue, which it is not. It is an international issue, and the issue is not between just India or Pakistan. It is an issue of over 14 million people across the ceasefire line who've been denied their basic fundamental rights. And that is until that issue has been addressed, we will not see peace in there.
Right. Mr. Qureshi, now let's just talk about the trajectory of things. When this happened on August 5th, Article 370 was scrapped, we saw a sudden uproar. We saw many people coming out on the streets. We saw the international community giving a reaction. Now, as time progresses, you're talking about how narratives are changing. Is there still time for there to be a correction of the narrative, to bring back the Kashmiri voice at the center stage?
I think this is a big opportunity to do that. And at this point, if we fail to bring the true narrative back into the picture through the true voices of the Kashmir, that is when we're lost. It is never too late. I think we need to work together, get united under that single banner of right of self-determination, and make sure we provide a stable platform and a support to the true voices of the people of Kashmir, who can take it to the international level and ensure the right narrative is addressed. The key concern of right of self-determination is being addressed, that this narrative is not over-tainted or shadowed by the Article 370 or restoration of human rights alone.
Right. And on that point of human rights, Mr. Qureshi, what are the reports that have come out and what do we know so far about the state, especially of schools and educational institutions for children and women specifically?
Absolutely. As I said, the situation on the ground is really dire. The last we heard, if you remember, there was a report done by Parvez Imroz about a month ago. At that time, over 40,000 youth had been kidnapped during the nighttime and imprisoned. We don't know the whereabouts of those. The atrocities against the women still continue. Ms. Sheeraz just mentioned the dire psychological impacts of the youth in academia. But the challenge we have is there is no academia in Kashmir. All the schools are under lockdown. Children are unable to go to school. They're unable to study. There's no means for them to get to the school. Their teachers are unable to come to school and deliver that education. So the basic rights that we take granted in a modern civilized world, the education, the security, right to live, access to medical facilities, food, water, that has all been taken away from the people of Kashmir. Clearly, India wants to orchestrate a genocide, but in a very indirect means at this point, by letting the people of Kashmir suffer and suffer till death.
Right. That's a strong point you make there, Mr. Qureshi. And I just want to talk to Ms. Sheeraz about this specific point before we end the show here. Ms. Sheeraz, now, when we're talking about all of this, all the oppression that's being caused, we're talking about this constant state of fear that we're being lived on. We talked about children, but I do want to touch upon the point of women and how they are disproportionately impacted by war and conflict, the psychological impacts of that.
Yes, I would like to shed a light on that. Obviously, I mean, you can well imagine in war conflicted areas, and I believe there are certain valleys in Kashmir. There are not even a single house where you're going to find a woman who's not a widow, and there is not even a single house that is not affected by these war crimes, especially what is happening in Kashmir. This is absolutely a tragedy, and lack of health supervision or lack of health resources is not there, obviously. So this is there's a need to talk about on the international forum that these women are actually suffering from a lot of not only physical health, but their mental health is absolutely on the last stage of what we say of diagnosis. So there's a need to talk about it, to recognize how these women are suffering from depression, from anxieties, from hopelessness, from helplessness. They're looking at their families, they're looking at their children, they're looking at their fathers and the brothers dying, suffering. It's a very devastating situation.
Right.
This is what I have to say.
Right. On that point, thank you, Ms. Syeda, Ayesha, Sheeraz for joining us from Lahore, and Mr. Zaffar Qureshi for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.